Well, good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I want to give special thanks to Barbara and Stephen for inviting me to share my work in the workshops. Well, excuse my clumsy English. Yes, please. Well, start with this. Well, Sophismata. I will begin with these two sides about the origin and aid of the Tertiation paradox in the Middle Age. As you can see, these two texts make it clear two things. A, the paradox begin to be interesting in the 13th century. B, that their origin is diverse. C, that they reaches their golden age in the 14th century. Two, Buridan. We can trace the development of his approach to insolubles from his early Tractatus de Consequentiis dating from 1330 through his commentary on Aristotle's posterior analytics, sophistical refutation, and metaphysics. This text to spade and read make it clear that Sophismata is a work from Buridan's mature period. The chapter 8 of Buridan's Sophismata is devoted to self-referential propositions. Buridan tells us he's going to deal with propositions that are self-referential. He stands at that the chapter contains propositions called insolubles. To finish clarifying the context in which Buridan worked, it should be noted. 1. Also, the liar is the paradox most commonly treated in the insolubles. It's not the only one. As Ironosuri say, insolubles do not only deal with the liar paradox. 2. Although self-reference is linked to the truth in most literature on paradox, we well know that it's not the only way to provoke self-reference. The example in the slide is the read. You can see. So according to this proposition is false and no proposition is negative are both examples of self-referential proposition. Three, first sophism. In its Hughes divide the chapter 8 of Sophismata into 4 sections. For the present work, the important point is that the first section, Sophism 1 to 6, are about the condition of the validity of inference. This paper specifically about the insoluble with which chapter 1 began, which says, every proposition is affirmative, therefore no proposition is negative. Primum sophisma, omnis propositio est affirmativa, ergo nulla propositio est negativa. Hughes described well the nature of sophism in the following passage. The sophism itself is an inference. The question to be asked about it is not explicitly stated, but is clearly and is the inference valid? Also, in most cases, as Pironet said, a sophism proper is a sentence rather than an argument. In the case that we are seeing, the sophism is an inference. Therefore, if we look at the distinctive feature of insoluble, we see that two topics converge on its logical consequence and self-reference. And self-reference is used to point out and answer some criticisms of the notion of logical consequence. 4. From a meta-logical point of view, Sophismata is a treatise that presents questions from a theoretical point of view, but also from a meta-theoretical point of view. As Pironet points out, on a basic level, the Sophismata served to illustrate a theory, but they were also used to test the limits of a theory. Hughes makes a similar comment. They were used primarily, but not exclusively, for the testing and application of logical rules. Thus, Sophismata is a suitable field for posing meta-theoretical questions, and this is what Buridan does with the first insoluble. At the beginning of Sophismata, Buridan is exploring the limits of the notion of logical consequence and the logical rules that govern it. 5. Logical consequence in Sophismata. It's convenient to distinguish the contemporary works dedicated to medieval logical consequence from that dedicated to medieval logical consequence in Sophismata, since this second approach has two characteristics that make unique. A. Self-referential sentences play an essential role. B. The proposition Nulla Propositio es negativa is the conclusion of the argument. Saying in his work, Buridan gives you two examples of inference in which the proposition Nulla Propositio es negativa appear. The first of the two examples appear in the Tractatus de Consequentiis, and the second in the Sophismata. 1. No proposition is negative, therefore no ask is running, in Tractatus de Consequentiis. 2. Every proposition is affirmative, therefore no proposition is negative, in Sophismata. As you can see, in 1, no proposition is negative, is the premise of the inference. In 2, no proposition is negative, is the conclusion. From this inference, plus the consideration of self-reference, we can establish the following classification that you observe in the slide. My work is linked with 2. 5. Nulla Propositio es negativa. Something that captures our attention when contemplating 1 and 2 inference is that in both they have a common sentence. No proposition is negative. We are going to present the logical particularities of the IPN sentence, which we can summarize in 5 basic items. For time reason, I just mention them. A. The sentence Nulla Propositio es negativa was studied by Jean Buridan, always linked to the notion of logical consequence. B. IPN is self-referential. C. IPN have a syntactic character. In this sense, IPN does not generate self-reference using predicate truth or note utility semantics predicates. D. IPN does not behave like a classical paradoxical paradoxical sentence regarding negation. You can see in the slide because this. E in PA is a case of proposition that is always false. Basically, Jean Buridan argued that the sentence no proposition is negative cannot be true, since to be true, it must be there. And if it is there, there is at last one negative proposition, namely in PN itself. Well, my proposal. I am going to argue that there are three notions of logical consequence under consideration in the first insoluble. Two are well described by Hughes as theory A and theory B. The third, which we will call theory C, not mentioned by Hughes, but is proposed by Buridan himself in his first three arguments in favor of the validity of the insoluble. I am going to show A, that these three arguments, from which omnis propositio es affirmativa, ergo nulla propositio es negativa, can be validly derived, are based on basic rules for the characterization of the logical consequence, and allow us to consider omni propositio es affirmativa, ergo nulla propositio es negativa, a material consequence, to later transform it into a formal consequence. Then I will show B that in the first sophism of chapter A of Sophismata, Buridan points out that theory A is incorrect and that he rejects theory B and accepts theory C. C, that pointing out theory A as incorrect and accepting theory C lead to, alas, two paradoxes. Eight, logic and semantics. To understand Buridan's logic correctly, it is necessary to attend to some semantics and ontological questions related to language which influence semantic concepts such as truth or validity. As the quote from Reed explained, for a proposition to be true before it must exist, it must be writing, thought, or uttered. All such expressions, including mental expression, are for Buridan concrete contingent particulars. Arthur Pryor dedicated a paper of Buridan modal distinction between possible and possible true, and Sarah Uckelman's formalization of the semi-formalization which Pryor used to analyze Buridan insoluble is interesting in own right. For reason of time, I will only point out a few features that will serve my purpose. We will call it BPU logic, and this is the more important characteristics. A, omni propositio es affirmativa and nulla propositio es negativa. They are well-formed formulas in this logic. B, that some of the sentences are tautologies in the sense that A, they cannot be false on any word, time, or sheet. The sheet is the example of the prior. For example, nulla affirmativa is negativa, or quadem propositio is negativa, while others cannot be true on any word, time, or sheet. For example, nulla propositio is negativa cannot be true never, in any time, in any word, etc. C, that the first condition for the truth of a sentence is that is writing on a sheet. This is make justice to the idea that it is a temporal object. D, with its elements, we already have the possibility of generating self-reference, avoiding any confusion between object language and meta language. Say you command, we can use sentence to make claims about the syntax of the other sentence in a completely unproblematic manner, which involve no confusion of meta language and object language. 9. The structure of insoluble and the first insoluble. The analysis and solution of an insoluble is similar to the highly formalized scholastic method for determining a question. First, one has to examine the argument pro and contra. Second, one has to present one's own solution to the problem. Third, one has to refute the arguments supporting the opposed answer. However, as Hughes notes, this canonical way of proceeding is abandoned for Buridan, who introduced two modifications in the procedure when dealing with the first insoluble. I'm very interested in the B. B say, between the statement of his own view and the replies to the opposing arguments, he, Buridan, interposed a sequence of 5 conclusions. Also, those conclusions are formally an interruption of the standard pattern. They contain the heart of what Buridan has to say here. For all this, for the sake of the argument, I will present Buridan's arguments in 3 blocks described below. First, the so-called theory A, of which Buridan says cannot be correct. Then the one called by Hughes theory B, which Buridan seems to accept but then rejects. And finally, what I call theory C, which is present in the first 3 arguments following the enunciation of the insoluble. Well, 9.1, theory A. What we will call theory A, following Hughes, corresponds to the rejection of the first definition of consequence that Buridan gives us in Tractatus de Consequentiis. Definition that Buridan considers defective and expressed in this way. But this definition is defective or incomplete because every human is running, so some human is running is a good consequence, but it's possible for the first to be true, the second not being true, when the second does not exist at all. This is Buridan's rejection of theory A, which is repeated in Sophismata. You can see this in opposition 2. A consequence is not valid if the antecedent can be true without the truth of the consequent. But this is the case here. For signs, the antecedent can be true and the consequent cannot be true. And repeat the same idea in the first conclusion. The first conclusion is that some consequence is valid whose antecedent can be true without the truth of consequent and without the consequent. Well, Buridan rejects the notion of consequence that says an inference. Buridan rejects the notion of consequence that says an inference is valid if and only if it is impossible for the premises to be true without the conclusions also being true. This is the theory A and the Buridan's rejection. Theory B. What will call theory B express the definition of consequent that in Tractatus de Consequentiis is immediately subsequent of the started by theory A and somehow corrects it. Say the one proposition is antecedent to the other proposition if it is impossible that it be true, the other not being true when they are formed together. Yes, the aggregate is together. Buridan seemed to accept in principle that this definition works, but later he will reject it in both the Tractatus de Consequentiis and Sophismata. We are interested that both rejections have a factor in common. In Tractatus de Consequentiis, Buridan says, I prove the main claim because the opposite of the antecedent does not follow from the opposite of the consequent. Thus, as you can see below, it has been the interpretation of Reed. In Sophismata, Buridan presents two reactions for rejecting theory B. The first is that if the definition is good, it accepts too much. Buridan complains the proposition always false, no proposition is affirmativa, no proposition is affirmativa, implies any proposition. No proposition is affirmativa, ergo the stick is in the corner. As you can see in the text, in the 5th conclusion, it is argued in the second part that the inference is not valid because the opposite of the consequence does not entail the opposite of the antecedent. Thus, Buridan rejects theory B basically for failing to meet contraposition or the rule of contraposition. It's clear here. Because the opposite of the consequence doesn't entail the opposite of antecedent. Well, theory C. Buridan is going to give 3 arguments in favor of the validity of the inference Nulla Propositio es affirmativa, ergo Nulla Propositio es negativa. I am going to first to present and later analyze them one by one. This is the 3 arguments. Yes. P1, this is proved for the locus from contraries. This is the text of Buridan. Yeah. P1 is argument for the locus from contrarios. P2 is the possibility of generating an entamine, syllogism, the argument, and P3 for comparing here for completing contraposition rule. You can see this rule is common to a very valid consequence. Yes. Well, this is the Buridan's argument in the Sophismata in favor to the validity of the insolubilia, the first sophisma. In this section of the paper, we will evaluate one by one, from a logical point of view, the arguments presented above by Buridan in favor of the validity of the sophism. P1, the locus from contrario. About Buridan's Uckelmann's first arguments points out the first one turns on an equivalence representable in modern notation as and adds, this is just the interdefinability of the quantifiers. This is fine, but it must be recognized that interdefinability is not enough. Justification is not complete without accepting that there are contrary predicates, pairs of predicates such that if uno is a predicate of the una thing, the other is excluded from that possibility. In other words, the two sentences cannot be equated in a purely extensional way. They require the intentional aggregate on the meaning of contrary predicate for the inference to be bona inferentia. Accepting this, the sentences are not only inferred from each other, but we can go further. Omnis propositio is affirmative and nulla propositio is negativa. They say the same things. These are responses that serve to become aware of the intuitive force of the validity of the argument, but more importantly, they show us that we are facing a material consequence. This is P1. P2, syllogism and formal consequence. Buridan's second argument for sophisms is even more interesting since it connects the material validity of omnis propositio es affirmativa, ergo nulla propositio es negativa, with formal validity. Buridan, in the second argument, gives us the method of transforming the insoluble into a syllogism. But what does it mean that we can syllogize? It means that there is a formal consequence as stated in the cited by Reid. The method is easy. The only thing that is needed is to add the necessary sentence, nulla affirmativa es negativa, and we will have a syllogism in clare. We can add something derived from prior and Uckelmann analysis for the strength of the argument. The necessity for nulla affirmativa es negativa comes from its condition of tautology in BPU logic. Another way of demonstrating the validity of the insoluble, analogous to the previous one and not mentioned by Buridan in Sophismata, is linked to Buridan's proposal to transform material consequence into formal consequence. Simple material consequence reduced to formal consequence by adding a necessary true premise. We must first recognize omnis propositio es affirmativa, ergo nulla propositio is negativa, as a material consequence, and after this follow the rule that Buridan himself gives us to transform a material consequence into a formal consequence, as can be seen in the quoted text. But O insoluble is a formal consequence. What does this imply? I see two Dutil novice. Is formal consequence equivalent to the logical consequence? So far, I have been considering the two notions as wholly equivalent. In particular, I claim that Buridan's notion of formal consequence is a very good model of the intuitive notion of logical consequence. Thus, we have that Buridan's second argument in favor of the insoluble guarantees that between nulla propositio es negativa and omnis propositio es affirmativa, there is, at worst, a formal consequence, and at best, logical consequence. The last argument is the argument of contraposition rule. Buridan say, some proposition is negativa, therefore not every proposition is affirmativa, is obviously valid. The reason is the opposite of the consequent entirely opposite of the antecedent. Therefore, the consequence is valid. For this rule is common to every valid consequence. Every proposition formed as consequence is a good consequence if the contradictory of the antecedent of the side consequence follow from the contradictory of the consequent of the side consequence. In Tractatus de Consequentiis, Buridan discute the validity of the inference, no propositions negativa, etc., confront con Dutil novice and clima. El point, I can utilizing the contemporary logic for formulating the inference. We can reformulate this rule usando contemporary symbols as follows. Yes, this is the contraposition, and my version of contraposition rule applies to inference. The medieval logic is a rule logic, is a logic that utilizes many rules, as Boyce says. Tractatus de Consequentiis is a quasi-deductive system of rules with a clear distinction between principal rules and those derived from them. And Dutil novice says, medieval logicians sought not only to establish the validity of the such basic rules, they also made inquiries on the very nature of the logical consequence. An inference. It's, in this sense, their investigation overlaps not only with the modern proof theory, but also with the modern philosophy of logic. Okay. Contraposition rule and theory A. We can ask, what is the relationship between the definition presented in theory A, incorrect for Buridan, and the contradiction rule accepted for Buridan and contained in theory C? As you can see in the Dutil novice text, the relation between rule of contraposition and definition, the theoria, is another formulation of the same idea. This is here, yes? For routine device, contraposition rule and definition of valid consequence are another formulation of the same idea. This, in other words, are equivalent, yes? To support this idea, we can show that from the definition of consequence presented in theory A, the contraposition rule follows. Here is the proof. Yeah, we can derivate the contraposition rule from the definition to the theory A. Summarizing, I show it that Buridan reaches theory A and theory B. I show it that theory A asserts that there is no logical consequence between true premise and false conclusion. 3. I show it that Buridan accepts theory C. And 4. By the first locus of the opposite arguments between Omni Propositio es affirmativa and Nulla Propositio es negativa, there is a material consequence. By the second argument, the syllogization between Omni Propositio es affirmativa and Nulla Propositio es negativa, there is a formal consequence. 6. By the third argument, to complete with the contraposition rule between Omni Propositio es affirmativa and Nulla Propositio es negativa, there is logical consequence. 7. I show it that theory A and contraposition rule are not independent. They both present the same idea of logical consequence and are derivable from each other. Finally, to paradox. From all that has been said, we can point out that if we mark theory A as incorrect and accept theory C as good, there are, I believe, two paradoxes. Paradox 1. If theory A and theory C are equivalent, since they are different representations of the same notion of logical consequence, so that different consequence cannot be derived from them. In other words, the set of their validity inference have the same extension, but Omni Propositio is affirmativa, ergo Nulla Propositio is negativa, is valid inference in theory C. But Omni Propositio is affirmativa, Nulla Propositio is negativa, is invalid in theory A. Therefore, there is a sentence that is a consequence and is not a consequence of the same theory. Here is the contradiction and therefore the paradox. For the last paradox, paradox 2, I make one last detour. We use and adapt Kreisler's idea, the squeezy argument by Kreisler, as presented by Hartfield to frame for my argument. Let's imagine that validity is not something to define, but a primitive. To contextualize it more and as it holds, I claim that material consequence must remain the primitive notion. Patterns of logically, formally valid consequence are attempts to model and capture an increasing number of material consequences, but these formal patterns do not offer the very foundation for validity. The following two clauses are proposed. 1. We should think of the intuitive notion of validity not as literally defined by the model theoretic account, or in another manner, Rather, we should think of it as a primitive notion. 2. We then use intuitive principles about validity together with technical results from model theory to argue that the validity extensionally coincides with the technical notion. To elaborate our version, the Kreisel approach, consider some specific formalization F. The one provided by the prior Uckelman logic and prior Uckelman rules call an argument derivable in F if its conclusion can be derived from its premise together with the prior Uckelman's tautologies of F, using only the rule of F. Then the idea is that intuitive principles about validity guarantee 1. Intuitive soundness of F. Any argument is derivable in F is valid intuitive. 2. If there is a model in which the premise of an argument are true and the conclusion isn't, then the argument is not valid intuitive. 3. Model assumption. Any argument that is not valid technically is not valid intuitively. Paradox. As we can see, omnis propositio is affirmative, ergo nulla propositio is negativa, is valid intuitive. Science is derivable, but by 2 is not valid intuitive. Thus, omni propositio is affirmativa, ergo nulla propositio es negativa, is valid intuitive and not valid intuitive, which implies a contradiction and therefore a paradox. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Sorry for the time.
No, it's perfect timing, actually. And then the talk was very, very interesting. I guess there are a lot of questions coming. So the floor is open if someone wants to raise a question.
Yes. I can see the one.
Okay, Stephen is the first question, not surprisingly.
I waiting this.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much indeed. That was very, very interesting. There's an awful lot there. I made quite a lot of notes of things to raise, but I think I'll just concentrate on one to start with, and that's this strange method that the medievals have, many of them, including Buridan here. If I want to prove an argument's valid, I'll say, well, it's the contrapositive of another argument, and that argument's valid. And you think, well, that's not very, very deep. That's purely regressive. If I'm doubting whether one argument is valid, I might be equally dubious about the validity of its contrapositive. So what sort of persuasive force has this got? So I was intrigued by what you found in Buridan, which is to connect that notion of, or that method, shall we say, to connect that method with theory A. But I think I want to question whether that's the right thing to do, because contraposition needn't be stated in terms of truth values. You don't need to state contraposition in terms of an argument is valid if whatever the contradictory of the conclusion is true, the contradictory of the premise is true. You can simply state it in terms of whether or not the contradictory of the premise follows from the contradictory of the conclusion, You don't need to bring truth into it at all. Have I misunderstood you here? I hope I'm not being unfair to what you said, but it seems to me that you can connect the method of appealing to the contrapositive with any of the three theories and any other theory for that matter, without needing to bring truth or falsity into it.
Okay. Sorry, I have a problem with my connection. Just a moment. You can hear me?
I can hear you. Yes. Let me know if you need me to repeat any of that. I come exactly and well your point. Your point is about contraposition. Yes.
I don't hear well what is the point. Is for the use of contraposition or for the interpretation?
No.
Sorry.
I started by raising what's always seemed to me to be an oddity about the medievalist procedure, namely to appeal to contraposition in order to establish that an argument is valid. It seems to be, put simply, that's regressive. It's going to depend upon your accepting that the contrapositive argument is valid. And the natural thought is that if you're doubtful about the validity of an argument, you'll be equally dubious about its contrapositive. What I found interesting about your talk, well, among other things, many things were interesting.
Okay.
Go on.
Yes. I think in medieval logic in general, in Paulus Venetus, or here is very clear. The contraposition rule is a very basic rule, and your interpretation is problematic. I think in any moment connecting the interpretation of the apparent contraposition rule with the connective logic, I think that we have. I will have in an interpretation, in a rigorously interpretation for a contraposition rule. I don't sure if my interpretation is correct. I want to question this to you, but if I in the correct interpretation, is very interesting the solutions and the problems that this interpretation have. I many grateful for your suggestion. I can think more for definitive response to you.
Okay, maybe I'll write this down and email you about it, because it's quite a difficult point to get across verbally. Probably better written down. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
If you want to raise a question, just put your name in the chat box. So if I may, while we wait for questions, according to your interpretation, the material consequence should be kind of set a subset of which is the formal consequence. Okay, now the question was if, in your view, the formal consequence is just a subset of the material consequence, or if I got you correctly when you said that he tries to capture some patterns.
What? Can you write the question, please?
Yeah.
Or no? Okay, Barbara. Thank you very much. No, according to me, the material consequence, I tend to, I have the same opinion that read in this article about the formal and material consequence. Material consequence is an independent consequence, and formal consequence can be seen as an intent to produce it pattern for the material consequence. Omnis propositio es afirmativa, ergo nulla propositio es negativa, is materially valid, and Buridan is the first preoccupation for Buridan is demonstrate that validity of the material consequence. The locus of contrarios, the locus de contrarios is an intent for be clear that this consequence is a material consequence. Now, you can transformate material consequence in formal consequence. Formal consequence is posterior. If you have material consequence, you can have a formal consequence. It's not a subset, but is epistemic. In Buridan words, Buridan says, I don't know when I have front a material consequence. The method for accelerating when you have a material consequence is transforming the material consequence in a formal consequence. I detected the material consequence, and if can transformate material consequence in formal consequence, I have a guarantee that is this intuitive material consequence is really a material consequence. I am clear or not?
Yeah, and this matches with the make more evident that he says, talking about formal consequence, which as Caterina Dutil-Novaes has stressed is it belongs to the epistemic.
Yes, Dutil-Novaes see an analogy in formal concept between formal consequence and logical consequence in the Echemendy words and representational logical consequence. It's very interesting, but Buridan put first material consequence, and for epistemological reason propose a method for transform material consequence in formal consequence.
Okay, thanks. So a question from Stephen.
Mute myself. Thank you. This is just what in the jargon is sometimes called a finger on the last question. It's quite interesting to note that some medieval logicians counted formal consequence as a species of material consequence, and Buridan is one of them, I believe. And others thought that formal consequences and material consequences contrasted, and that were separate species of consequence. And Paul of Venice is one of those. Just a side comment on the last on the last discussion.
No, it's for me is very interesting your interpretation to the material consequence as independent and consequence, because I believe that is the medieval interpretation of the material consequence. After this, Buridan and others propose the method of transformation, but material consequence is the study of material consequence is a point very interesting in the study of the intuitive notion of logical consequence. Today, we have many material in medieval logicians for studying this point and can new conclusions about intuitive notion of logical consequence.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for my inconvenience technicals. Thank you very much. Thank you, especially Stephen.